Empty grain silos in towns nobody can reach, gold mines guarded by men with rifles who answer to no government, and villages that have been sealed off from the rest of the country for years, surviving on whatever a military convoy can fight its way in to deliver. Burkina Faso has become all of these things. A little over a decade ago, this was one of the calmer corners of West Africa. Poor, yes, but stable, known across the continent as the land of upright people. Today, it carries a very different name. More civilians are killed here by armed groups than in any other country on the planet. However, the story of how a quiet farming nation became the deadliest place on earth is not the one you have probably been told. It did not begin with religion. It began with a collapse that started more than 1,000 miles away. Before we go further, if you enjoy deep dives like this, the ones that break down how whole nations rise, crack, and fall apart, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Now let us get into how it all fell apart. To understand what Burkina Faso lost, you first have to understand what it was. The name itself is a promise. Back in 1984, a young revolutionary leader named Thomas Sankara took the old colonial name Upper
Leader in
Volta
uniform.
and threw
He's
it out.
one of them.
In
You
its
see,
place, he stitched
unlike
together
many
two
heads of
local
state who sit
languages
far
to
from the
create a
battlefield,
single phrase.
protected by distance
Burkina
and wealth,
Faso,
Traoré stays
the land
close.
of the
He doesn't
upright,
joke with his
honest
soul.
people. Sankara wanted a
But the
nation
plan
that
doesn't
fed
stop
itself,
there.
that
According
answered
to the
no
files
foreign
pulled from
master,
Bazy's
that took
confiscated
pride in being
phone,
poor,
a
but
large
principled.
portion of that
He pushed
24
campaigns
billion
to plant
CFA
trains,
francs
to
was set
vaccinate
aside to
children,
hire
to grow the
mercenaries,
country's own
not
food
African
instead of
fighters,
begging
but
for it.
foreign
For a few
contractors.
short years,
Yes,
this small
this is where the
landlocked
web
place
gets even
became a
darker.
symbol of a different kind of African future. Then it was cut short. He was assassinated in 1987, and the man who replaced him, Blaise Compaoré, held on to power for 27 long years. Compaoré was no dreamer. He was a survivor, a fixer, a man who kept himself in office by making deals in every direction. And here is a piece of dark irony that will matter later. For years, Compaoré quietly acted as a middleman with armed groups across the region, negotiating with the very kinds of fighters who would one day tear his country apart. As long as he sat in the capital, Ouagadougou, a strange sort of peace held. But even under all of that, the country kept a certain rhythm. Farmers grew cotton, sorghum, and millet across the center and the south. Miners pulled gold out of the ground. Life was hard and money was tight, but the guns mostly stayed quiet. That began to change in 2014. Compaoré tried to alter the constitution so he could rule even longer, and the people had finally had enough. Massive crowds poured into the streets, set fire to the parliament, and forced him to flee the country in a matter of days. It was a genuine popular uprising, and for a moment, it felt like a fresh start. But it also ripped out the old system that had kept the region's fighters at arm's length. The fixer was gone. The quiet deals were gone. And into that new uncertainty, the storm that had been building next door came rolling in. Because the north was always the forgotten part. Up near the borders with Mali and Niger, in the dry Sahel scrubland, the government was more of a rumor than a presence. Roads were bad, schools were few. Clinics were a day's travel away if they existed at all. If you were a herder or a farmer up there, the state showed up to collect taxes and to punish and rarely to give anything back. There were old resentments simmering too between farming communities and the nomadic herders who moved their cattle across the same shrinking land. That neglect and that resentment would matter enormously later. It was the dry grass waiting for a spark. The spark came from Libya. In 2011, the regime of Muammar Gaddafi collapsed, and when it fell, his enormous stockpiles of weapons were looted and scattered. Rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and the fighters who knew how to use them, all of it began flooding south across the Sahara. Many of those fighters were Tuareg, a people spread across the desert, and they carried their weapons home into northern Mali. In 2012, they launched a rebellion. But that rebellion was quickly hijacked by something far more dangerous. Armed groups flying the banner of jihad seized the moment, pushed the Tuareg aside, and took control of an area of northern Mali the size of a small country. They imposed brutal rule, banning music, smashing shrines, and handing out harsh punishments in the towns they held. France sent in troops in 2013 and pushed them back. On paper, it was a victory. In reality, you cannot bomb an idea, and you cannot kill men who simply melt into the population and slip across a border. The fighters scattered, regrouped, and looked for softer ground. And right next door, waiting, was that dry, neglected northern edge of Burkina Faso, freshly destabilized by the fall of its longtime ruler. By 2015 and 2016, the violence had crossed over. In January of 2016, gunmen stormed a hotel and cafe in the capital itself, killing dozens of people, many of them foreigners, and holding the heart of Ouagadougou hostage for a night. It was a message: Burkina Faso was no longer a bystander to the war next door. It was now part of it. From there, two main forces spread across the country like cracks across glass. One was linked to Al-Qaeda, an alliance of local groups that eventually merged into an organization known as JNIM. The other was tied to the Islamic State, operating in the vast, lawless triangle where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso meet. At times, these two even fought each other, turning whole districts into a three-way war between the state and two rival extremist networks. And here's the part that gets left out of the frightening headlines. These groups did not conquer the north by converting people at gunpoint. They grew by walking into places the government had abandoned and offering something the state never had. They settled disputes. They protected one community's cattle from another's raids, then flipped and did the reverse for a price. They offered angry, jobless young men a rifle, a purpose, and a paycheck. Where there was no police, no court, and no road, they became all three at once. They were especially good at exploiting the old fault line between farmers and herders. When the state and its allies started treating one ethnic group, the Fulani, as automatic suspects, the insurgents were right there to offer protection and revenge. Every heavy-handed army sweep, every wrongful arrest, every village burned by the wrong side handed the recruiters another dozen fighters. There was even a homegrown preacher in the north, a man named Ibrahim Malam Dicko, who built his own movement out of these exact grievances before the bigger networks absorbed his followers. The war was feeding itself. The cruelty followed close behind. Villages were given ultimatums: pay a tax, follow our rules, close your school, send us your sons, or be wiped out. And the people caught in the middle of all this were not foreigners or outsiders. They were Burkinabe farmers and herders, the overwhelming majority of them Muslims themselves, being terrorized in the name of a faith most of them already practiced. That is the detail that shatters the simple version of this story. The victims and the killers so often prayed to the very same God in the very same language, facing the very same direction. There was a deliberate logic to the terror. Shutting down schools was not random destruction, it was strategy. The armed groups saw state-run Western-style education as the enemy, a machine pulling children away from their vision of the world. So they threatened teachers, burned classrooms, and in some cases killed educators outright. Tens of thousands of teachers fled. And once a school closes in a remote village, it almost never reopens. A generation of children was left with nothing to do and nowhere to be, which leads to the quietest horror of all. Idle, frightened, fatherless boys are exactly the raw material an insurgency needs. In a grim way, the war was manufacturing its own future recruits. Then the economy started to buckle, and it buckled around gold. Burkina Faso sits on some of the richest gold deposits in West Africa, and gold had become its single biggest export by far. For years, this was the country's great hope, the thing that was supposed to lift millions out of poverty. Instead, gold became fuel for the fire. Across the north and east, tens of thousands of small, informal mining pits dot the landscape, dug by hand by ordinary people with almost nothing. One by one, the armed groups took them over. They taxed the miners. They controlled who dug and who sold. They demanded a cut of every gram that came out of the earth. And they turned that raw gold into a river of cash that bought more weapons, more motorbikes, and more fighters. Much of it smuggled out through neighboring countries and sold into a global market that never asks too many questions. The very thing meant to save the country was now financing the people tearing it apart. The big industrial mines, the ones run by foreign companies, started pulling their staff out as the roads to reach them became death traps. Some suspended operations entirely. Others hired small armies of their own just to survive. Agriculture collapsed next, and this is where the hunger truly began. In a country where the vast majority of people live directly off the land, the war made the land itself impossible to reach. Farmers who walked out to their fields risked being kidnapped, shot, or forced to hand over their harvest. Herders had their animals stolen by the truckload, wiping out a family's entire wealth in a single raid. Markets, the beating heart of rural life, were burned or simply emptied out because no one dared to travel to them anymore. Trade routes that had run for generations went silent. And then came the blockades. This is one of the cruelest weapons in the entire war. The armed groups would surround a town, plant explosives on the roads leading in and out, and simply strangle it. Towns like Jibo in the north were cut off for years at a time, their tens of thousands of residents kept alive only by armed military convoys and the occasional aircraft dropping supplies from above. Picture what that actually means for a family living inside one of those siege towns. The market shelves go bare. A bag of grain that once cost a few dollars becomes a small fortune, if you can find one at all. The wells and pumps break down and cannot be repaired because the parts cannot get in. Fuel vanishes, so the generators die, so the phones go dark, so a mother has no way to know if her son on the other side of the country is even alive. Children grow thin. The sick cannot leave to find a hospital, and doctors cannot get in to reach them. People in these blockaded towns have starved to death in the 2020s, while the rest of the world scrolled past. Dozens of communities have lived like this, some of them for years on end. Now stack all of this on top of a national budget that was already stretched to breaking, and you can see the trap closing. Money that should have built schools and clinics was swallowed whole by the war effort. Foreign investment fled. Aid organizations pulled back or pulled out entirely because their workers were being killed and kidnapped. The economy did not crash in one dramatic day. It bled out slowly, town by blockaded town, harvest by lost harvest, until a country that had always been poor tipped into something far more desperate. But the deepest failure of all was the military itself. And this is where the story turns truly dark. On paper, Burkina Faso had an army. In reality, that army was underfunded, poorly equipped, badly led, and stretched impossibly thin across a country the size of Colorado, sent to chase an enemy that struck and then vanished into the population. Soldiers were posted to remote outposts and then, unbelievably, forgotten. The breaking point came in November of 2021 at a gendarme post called Inata. The men stationed there had gone weeks without proper supplies. Reports that surfaced afterward revealed they had been reduced to hunting animals just to feed themselves, sending increasingly desperate messages up the chain begging for food and reinforcements that never came. Then the outpost was overrun and dozens of them were slaughtered. When the details came out, the country erupted in fury. How could soldiers be left to starve and die while officials sat comfortably in the capital? That rage cracked the government wide open. In January of 2022, a group of officers led by a lieutenant colonel named Paul-Henri Damiba seized power in a coup, promising to finally crush the insurgency where the civilian government had failed. He could not. The attacks kept coming. The map kept shrinking. And just 8 months later, in September of 2022, he was overthrown too. This time by an even younger officer, a captain named Ibrahim Traoré, still only in his mid-30s. 2 coups in a single year in the same country over the same failure. Traoré arrived with fiery speeches, a populist swagger, and a sharp turn away from the West. He expelled the French troops who had been fighting in the region. He drew closer to Russia, welcoming Russian paramilitary fighters, the group once known as Wagner, to help prop up his forces. And to fill out his thin army, he leaned hard on something that would only deepen the tragedy. The government had already been recruiting civilians into a volunteer force, arming ordinary villagers with basic weapons and a few days of training and sending them out to defend their own communities. In theory, it was a clever way to hold ground the regular army simply could not. In practice, it often meant handing rifles to one ethnic group to go and fight another, pouring gasoline on tensions that had smoldered for generations. These lightly armed volunteers were massacred by the hundreds in ambushes, thrown into a war they were never equipped to win. And in the ugliest turn of the entire conflict, atrocities began to flow in both directions. The insurgents committed massacre after massacre. But so, according to human rights investigators, did some government forces and their armed auxiliaries accused of slaughtering unarmed civilians from communities they suspected of sympathizing with the enemy. In one incident near a village called Karma in 2023, men in army uniforms were accused of killing scores of people. The population was now being crushed from every side at once, with nowhere left that felt safe. The scale of the killing is almost impossible to hold in your head. In 2021, an attack on the village of Solhan left well over 100 people dead in a single night. In August of 2024, near the town of Barcelona, fighters attacked civilians who had been forced to dig defensive trenches around their own town, and hundreds were gunned down in what became one of the deadliest single massacres of the whole war. These are not distant statistics on a spreadsheet. Each number is a market that will never reopen, a school that will never ring its bell again, a village that will never be whole. And for every massacre that made the news, there were dozens of smaller killings that never did, in places too remote and too dangerous for any reporter to ever reach. Talk to the people who lived it, and the same details surface again and again. A father who buried his seed grain in the ground before he ran, hoping to dig it up when the fighting passed, knowing deep down that it never would. A grandmother who walked for days with children who were not even hers, because their parents were already gone. Families who once owned herds and land, now lining up for a single sack of rice in a camp on the outskirts of a city that does not want them there. Dignity is one of the first things a war like this steals, long before it takes a life. And the people carrying that loss are not statistics or symbols in somebody's argument online. They are farmers and mothers and shopkeepers who simply had the terrible luck of living where the state decided to disappear. By this point, the numbers describing the country had become almost unthinkable. More than 2 million people driven from their homes became refugees inside their own borders, one of the fastest growing displacement crises anywhere on Earth. Entire towns emptied out overnight as families fled with only what they could carry, crowding into camps and swelling the edges of safer cities, living under plastic sheeting, depending on aid that was itself running dry. Thousands of schools were forced to shut their doors, leaving well over 1 million children with no classroom to go to, an entire generation growing up knowing only fear and flight. Health clinics closed. Whole provinces slipped entirely out of government hands. By the most sober estimates, the state controlled only about half of its own territory. The rest was a patchwork of insurgent rule, besieged towns, and empty, mined, dangerous roads. And then came the title no country ever wants. Global analysts who track this kind of violence declared that Burkina Faso had become the country most devastated by terrorism in the entire world, surpassing places like Afghanistan and Syria. The wider Sahel region, this dry band of West Africa, had become the global epicenter of terrorism, accounting for a staggering share of all the deaths from it on the whole planet. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. A nation that had literally named itself for uprightness and honesty now sat at the very top of the world's grim list of the killed. And Burkina Faso was not suffering alone. The same fire was burning through its neighbors. In Mali, where all of this had started, and in Niger to the east, the identical pattern played out almost move for move.
Leader in uniform. He's one of them. You see, unlike many heads of state who sit far from the battlefield, protected by distance and wealth, Traoré stays close. He doesn't joke with his soldiers.
One after another,
but the plan doesn't stop there. According to the files pulled from Bazi's confiscated phone, a large portion of that 24 billion CFA francs was set aside to hire mercenaries, not African fighters, but foreign contractors. Yes, this is where the web gets even darker.
All sliding in the same direction at the same time. The government's answer to all of this was defiance and a rewriting of the story. Traoré and his fellow junta leaders in neighboring Mali and Niger, who had seized power in almost identical coups driven by almost identical failures, banded together and formed their own bloc, the Alliance of Sahel States. They announced they were quitting the regional grouping known as ECOWAS, the very body that had bound West African nations together for decades. They cast themselves as revolutionaries, throwing off the last chains of Western influence, and across parts of Africa and the internet, Traoré in particular became a genuine folk hero, a young man in fatigues standing up to the old powers. The propaganda spoke of sovereignty, of dignity, of victory just around the corner. Critics who questioned the story had a way of disappearing, conscripted to the front lines, or silenced altogether. But the reality on the ground kept getting worse. For all the speeches and all the online adoration, the attacks did not stop. In many stretches of the country, they intensified. Turning to Russian mercenaries did not turn the tide any more than the French troops had before them. The fundamental problem never went away, because you cannot defeat an insurgency that feeds on poverty, neglect, and ethnic grievance by simply swapping out which foreign flag flies beside your soldiers. The state had abandoned its own countryside long before the first jihadist ever set foot in it, and no amount of new weaponry, no amount of new allies could paper over that original, homegrown wound. There was a colder transaction hiding beneath the patriotic speeches, too. Foreign security never comes free. As Western partners were pushed out and Russian fighters were welcomed in, questions swirled about what these new friends were actually being paid, and whether the country's mines and minerals were quietly part of the price. It is an old pattern on this continent. A desperate government, unable to protect its own ground, trades away a piece of its wealth for men with guns, and the people who actually live on top of that wealth see none of the benefit. The gold that could have rebuilt the country kept flowing outward, only now toward a different set of hands. So here is where things stand. A country that once dreamed of feeding itself now watches its farmers flee their fields. A nation that struck gold now watches that same gold arm the men killing its people. An army that was supposed to protect the population has been beheaded twice by its own coups and accused of turning its guns on the very civilians it swore to defend. And through it all, the ordinary people of Burkina Faso, the upright, honest people the country was named for, remain trapped between insurgents who slaughter them and a state that too often cannot or will not keep them safe. It is tempting to look at a headline like this one and simply blame a religion. But that is the lie that hides the real tragedy. The dead in Burkina Faso are overwhelmingly Muslim. The farmers in the blockaded towns are Muslim. The children shut out of school are Muslim. The families crammed into the displacement camps are Muslim. This was never a war of one faith against the world. It was the story of what happens when a government vanishes from half of its own map and something colder and more brutal rushes in to fill the empty space it leaves behind. The weapons came from Libya. The chaos spilled over from Mali, but the vulnerability was homegrown, built patiently over decades of neglecting the very people who needed the state the most. For most of the outside world, almost none of this ever registered. There were no round-the-clock news specials, no viral hashtags, no emergency summits scrambling to respond. A conflict that has killed and uprooted people on this staggering scale unfolded in near silence, in a place judged too far away and too complicated for the global attention span. That silence is its own kind of verdict. It quietly says that where a tragedy happens can somehow matter more than how enormous it truly is. Burkina Faso is a warning written in real time, in blood, right now, while most of the world looks somewhere else. It shows how quickly stability can rot when the center stops holding, and how fast a poor but peaceful place can tip into something that looks a great deal like hell on earth. And the most haunting part of all is that there is no clear end in sight, no treaty on the horizon, no lasting victory that outlives the press release announcing it. Just a country still trying to remember what it once meant to be the land of upright people, and a region watching to see whether the same fate is coming for them next. Until the state finds its way back to the people it abandoned, that map will keep shrinking, and the upright, honest people will keep paying for it every day. If this story pulled you in and you want to understand more of these forgotten collapses unfolding across the world right now, there is another breakdown waiting for you on screen. Go watch it, and I will see you in the next one.